you've mentioned this term a few times, talked about the signal of abundance with carbohydrates, like signaling, I guess, to our metabolism that we are in an abundant state so that perhaps your body doesn't go into a scarcity mode, something like that. That seems like it might be that might contrast with some people's positive views on fasting. So I'm wondering how do you look at fasting? Do you fast at all? Do you think any of this feeding window stuff is useful? Is it useful for people dealing with certain conditions, or what are your views on fasting?
I think fasting is valuable in as much as it gives the gut a break.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are eating food that is irritating your gut, not putting that food in your body is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And that can help you sometimes sort out which foods are problematic, or it can give your gut time to regenerate and heal. The problem with fasting is that no one can fast forever, you die, and that it clearly increases stress hormones and decreases sex hormones. So fasting is not a signal of abundance. And I think there are better ways to figure out what's damaging your gut. But I think that sometimes for people, if they're putting in the wrong foods, you're going to increase endotoxin, lipopolysaccharide in the human body, which comes from dysbiosis and overgrowth of the wrong bacteria in the gut. So yeah, sometimes there are some positives to fasting, but I think overall it's a net negative for humans. And that's the way I think about things increasingly, is this net positive, net negative, or net balance. And, some things clearly net positive for me. Meat, organs, net positive. Fruit, net positive. Vegetables, I don't know, probably individual. I think for some people, vegetables are net negative. For some people, they're probably net zero, net balance. I think, grains, if they're properly fermented, can be net zero for people, or maybe net positive. But I think for other people, they're net negative. But fasting is net negative, I think, for humans. Some benefits, but I think net negative most of the time. I don't think you need to fast to improve your health. And I think that a lot of the claims about fasting are just fabricated. It's just, I don't know where people get these ideas of fasting. And here's the other thing, that there's a couple of pieces of fasting that need to be really brought to light. You do not need to fast to do cellular house cleaning. The idea that fasting is the only way or the best way to get autophagy is false. Autophagy is happening all the time. And the alternative perspective, which is almost never considered here, is that sometimes autophagy is damaging. And sometimes autophagy is an indication that you've done increased cellular damage. So guess what? You can clean your house. Autophagy is called cellular house cleaning. Sometimes you clean your house just because you clean your house and you made breakfast. But sometimes your house is really dirty because you threw a big rager party at your house and you just trashed your house. So it's also possible that autophagy is increased in people when they're fasting because you're causing cellular damage. And this is supported by the literature because, increased autophagy can be linked to, negative remodeling of the heart, sometimes cancers. It's not a good thing to have unlimited autophagy. It's not just like, oh, my house is so clean because I'm doing so much autophagy. But remember that if you're damaging cells, you need to do more autophagy. So it's possible that you're fasting or doing other things like that, and it's increasing markers of autophagy. Well, you had to do damage something. Did you break? You have to clean up. You just broke the vase. Your son just threw a baseball in the house and you broke a vase all over the floor. Now you have to do more house cleaning. But that wasn't a good thing. So the notion that you need to do fasting for autophagy is just bollocks. It's not supported by the literature. And there's lots of literature that you're doing autophagy all the time, and that foods and nutrients can trigger autophagy, like glucose triggers autophagy in some models. So eating sugar triggers autophagy. Okay.
Wow.
So it's much more nuanced than just house cleaning good, more house cleaning better. Right. There's negative, there's sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's the proper amount, but the idea that you need fasting to do cellular house cleaning is completely false. So I think that fasting is net negative. It's just a stressor for humans in general. It's more cortisol, it's more glucagon, it's more epinephrine. It's not good for humans. That's very controversial, but I think that I would love to have respectful conversations with people who feel differently. Connected with fasting is caloric restriction. Now, if you actually look at the literature, the studies that show that fasting is beneficial do not control for hypocaloric diets in people that are fasting. I'm not familiar with many or even any studies on fasting or time-restricted feeding that show benefits unless people are restricting calories. So this often gets muddied. So is calorie restriction beneficial for humans? Possibly, but possibly not. I think calorie restriction is also net negative for humans. But again, in animal models, in mice, in rats, in worms, a lot of these models are fed garbage. They're not fed. I don't know why this is the case, but like, why are rats not fed what they eat in the wild, right? Why are rats fed a chow diet? Probably because what they eat in the wild is not standardized. We have to standardize their food. But guess what standardized rat chow is? Guess what standardized mouse chow is? It's essentially the equivalent of a standard American diet. It's like McDonald's, Burger King, and Hardee's and Chick-fil-A put into a chow pellet. Like that's a standard mouse rat diet. Yeah, if you restrict calories, if you give rats the equivalent of less Chick-fil-A and McDonald's, they're healthier.
Right.
No shit, Sherlock, like, and we also know this. If you're obese, if you have insulin resistance, eating less food of any food, regardless of quality, will improve your insulin sensitivity in the short term, but it doesn't work long term. And we talked about why. So this is the guy with the Twinkie diet. He said, food quality doesn't matter. I can improve my insulin sensitivity by eating Twinkies at a calorie deficit. Yes, calorie restriction, eating less crappy food improves insulin sensitivity. I don't think anyone believes that's the answer long term. So food quality doesn't matter if you're doing calorie restriction. But again, where are your nutrients coming from? How are you affecting thyroid and sex hormones? What is the long-term outlook on this? In the short term, food quality doesn't seem to matter. But in long term, it's a huge variable that is never accounted for, or very rarely. So yeah, you can improve your insulin sensitivity by eating less food. You could eat donuts, right? You could eat, say your body is going to burn 2,200 calories. You could eat 1,600 calories a day of donuts and get, quote, healthier. But any human thinking about this is going to realize where are your nutrients coming from. Long term, that cannot be good for humans. Like you have to eat other food, and you're not going to be able to eat 1,600 calories of any food for the rest of your life because your adaptive thermogenesis is going to happen. You will eventually start slow down your weight loss. There's a really fascinating study called the Minnesota starvation experiment. So we talked earlier about the Minnesota coronary experiment. The Minnesota starvation experiment, I believe, was done in World War II with conscientious objectors. And they wanted to see what would happen if they gave people 1,700 calories a day. And the results were catastrophic. So for months and months, people ate 1,700 calories a day. The results were catastrophic. People can look up the results of this study. People had long-term, it took years for some people to resolve anxiety, depression, psychiatric illness, food hoarding, digestive issues, low energy, low libido, infertility. The long-term consequences of significant calorie restriction, I think it was like 30+% calorie restriction for these people, were catastrophic for humans. So hard on. Why are we surprised? These people are essentially starving,
Can I ask you one? So just anecdotally, I've done some longer fasting, but the ones that when I would do like a 24-hour fast, I would notice myself feeling good the next day, almost like a little bit more vitality or energy, perhaps. Is that just because your digestive system is not as much energy is being directed towards digestion, so you get a little energy boost, or how would you interpret that?
A couple of possibilities here. If you measured your adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are catecholamines. These go up when you do that. So this is part of the lipolysis response. So one theory here is that people may feel better when they fast because they're kind of getting like stress hormones.
Right.
Okay. You ever taken like a glucocorticoid like prednisone or something? Some people get a little manic when they take cortisol or prednisone, or some glucocorticoid like cortisol. Sometimes steroid hormones, specifically cortisol, and derivatives of cortisol, give people a little bit of mania. But definitely epinephrine. I recently had an allergic reaction to something I put on my skin. I had a botfly. So you know what botfly is? It's like this, it looks like a little bee, but it's not cute at all. It's a little fly that lays a larva in your skin, and then you get a worm growing in your skin. Oof. Yeah, it usually happens in the Amazon, but somehow I got it in Costa Rica. I had this bump on my wrist, and I was like, what is that? and then I squeezed a little worm out of it. So
Mm.
I had a bot fly on my wrist. It's the only time it's happened. I do live in the jungle, basically. And I put an herb on the wound. And I think I had an allergic reaction to that. And I ended up going to an emergency room in San Jose. And they gave me epinephrine because I was having an allergic reaction. It didn't really help long term. But I've never had an epinephrine injection in my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I never had an allergy to bees. I never had an EpiPen, you know, and like stuck it in myself. But I got an epinephrine shot, and it was like, oh, you know, you could feel like, whoa, you know, like you can feel your heart rate, and you're just like, you're jammed. It's like, it's basically the way it feels if you're lead climbing and you fall, or you're in traffic and someone cuts in front of you and you're like, you know, it's a startle response. This is epinephrine. These are catecholamines that are released in your brain and your body. Yeah. So these go up when you're fasting, and they're stress hormones in many ways. So it's possible that that's what's going on. And there's a lot of theories about this, but I think that is one explanation. It's also quite possible that you felt better because you're just resting your gut.
Right.
In conjunction with the epinephrine and the cortisol. It's all part of the picture. So it's very hard to tease it out.
Sure.
And again, I said, you know, in your situation, when you were dealing with this gut stuff, I don't doubt that resting your gut for 24 hours was probably a good thing. But, you know, there are other things. There's other variables in it too.
Right.
So,
What? Okay. Last question on fasting. If you're trying to cut fat, one of the hallmarks of, I guess, fitness that I've always abided by is you should do cardio fasted in the morning. Basically, if you're trying to lean out, do you think that works or no?
No, I don't think so. I think you're just going to increase your cortisol. It's going to be more stressful.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And you notice this if you're surfing in any water, and this is just my experience, my lived experience, but I think if people lived in cold places, when I used to be carnivore, or I would fast in the morning before I would surf, I was so much colder in the water. So much colder, right? My metabolism is not working. My thyroid is like, whoa, breaks. My reverse T3 is high, right? But if you eat before you go in cold water in the morning, you're so much warmer. And people say this all the time. They do ketogenic diets, they get cold. They restrict carbohydrates, they get cold. They fast, they get cold. You're cold because your metabolism is down, right? Your body temperature is down. Your basal metabolic rate is down. It's all of the things that are working against really what your ultimate long-term goal, which is vitality and longevity and all these things. Now, again, there's pluses and minuses, but this is my argument that these things are often net negative in a lot of people. I'll just finish up on caloric restriction because it's interesting to me that, you know, in worms, in C. elegans, if you do calorie restriction, they live longer. But in order to live longer, they go into this state of suspended animation called DAUR, D-A-U-R or D-A-U-E-R. It's called DAUR. Basically, they just shut down. And I think it's again, C. elegans versus a human. You've got, you know, millions and millions of years of evolution separating us. But the same things kind of start to happen in humans. We start to kind of get colder and run less hot and do less metabolism, and everything gets less, you know, like we're really doing less. We're not completely hibernating, but when we do these things too much, caloric restriction, fasting, we kind of put ourselves in this state of like semi-hibernation. Our body temperature drops. Right. And I don't think that's good for humans. I mean, okay, you could make an argument like, yeah, maybe you'll live longer if you're in semi-hibernation, but I think most people's radar goes up and thinks, I don't want to live in a semi-hibernating state for the rest of my life. Like, guess what? Semi-hibernating people don't really want to have as much sex. They don't really want to do as much exercise. They don't really want to do much of anything. So if that's the way you want to live the rest of your life, great. But again, the other thing that's interesting for me about caloric restriction when we go further up the chain of animals is primates. There's a set of 2 studies looking at rhesus macaque monkeys. One of them gave the monkeys like an evolutionarily consistent diet and then calorie restricted. And then the other one gave them like monkey chow. And the benefits of caloric restriction were only seen when the monkeys got monkey chow. No true benefits of caloric restriction when the control group is eating normal monkey diets, which is like fruit, you know, leaves, depending what this primate species eats. And so that's interesting. And the last thing I'll say about caloric restriction is that in the animal studies that have been done, the benefits of caloric restriction may be linked to increased saturation changes within the membranes of cells. So what I mean by that is when you do caloric restriction in C. elegans or mice and rats, you can look at their cell membranes and their mitochondria, and they become more saturated. So less polyunsaturated membranes are associated. So there's increased saturation in membranes when you do caloric restriction. How interesting is that? So if there is a benefit to caloric restriction, is it that you are undoing what you've done with years of eating seed oils? And so then again, you have to say, like, is it net negative? Is it net positive? Look, I would argue just eat less fat and don't eat any seed oils and limit linoleic acid religiously in your diet, and you'll be better off long term because your thyroid and your sex hormones won't decline. But the caloric restriction fasting thing is very fascinating because there is evidence that caloric restriction is beneficial in some species.
Yeah.
In humans, it's questionable. Maybe calorie trial, but those people were sort of obese. But yeah, if it works, does it work in humans that are eating a healthy diet, and does it work potentially by reversing the damage of seed oils? Maybe. Or excess linoleic acids. That's all something to think about.
So cool. So yeah, I mean, the old saying, quality over quantity, right, applies in a lot of domains, it sounds like.
I think it does. That's the key. It's all about quality.